She had arrived with nothing but a worn bag and a dead man's letter, and the town of Briar Ridge decided she was already someone else's problem. What nobody told Elena Mercer was that the house she was walking into hadn't heard laughter in 14 months, that the children inside hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 weeks, that the man who owned it had stopped being a father the same night he stopped being a husband. This is not a love story. This is a war story, fought with cast iron skillets, torn shirts, and the kind of silence that breaks people from the inside out. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far it travels. Hit like, stay until the end. Here we go. The town was dying, and everyone knew it, but nobody said it out loud because saying it out loud would make it real. Briar Ridge sat on a flat stretch of high desert where the wind came off the mesa every afternoon and took whatever moisture was left in the soil with it when it went. 3 years of decent rain, then nothing. The creek that fed the eastern fields had dropped to a brown trickle by June. By July, it had stopped entirely, leaving nothing behind but cracked mud and the dried husks of whatever had been trying to grow there. The general store had cut credit. The mill had reduced hours. 2 families had already packed their wagons and headed north without saying goodbye to anyone, which told you everything about the mood of the place. When people stop saying goodbye, they've already given up on the idea that anything here is worth preserving. It was into this particular version of misery that Elena Mercer arrived on the afternoon of July 14th, stepping off the southbound stage with a canvas bag that had seen better decades and a look on her face that said she was used to arriving places that didn't want her. She was 31 years old, though she looked older in certain lights. The kind of older that comes not from age, but from having had to figure things out on her own for too long. Medium height, dark hair pinned back with more efficiency than elegance, wearing a brown wool traveling dress that was too heavy for the heat and had a repaired tear along the left cuff that she hadn't bothered to hide. Her hands were the hands of someone who worked. The townspeople noticed that first. The stage stop was in front of Harlan's Feed and Supply, which meant most of the town's mid-afternoon foot traffic saw her arrive. 2 women standing outside the dry goods store stopped their conversation entirely. A man leaning against the post office wall pushed his hat up and stared without pretending not to. 3 children chasing a dog around the water trough halted their game long enough to watch the stranger climb down from the stage. Nobody moved to help her with her bag. She didn't seem to expect it. She stood in the street with the July heat pressing down on her and the dust from the stage still settling around her boots, and she looked at a piece of paper she pulled from her coat pocket. Looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up and scanned the storefronts until her eyes found the sign she was looking for. Briar Ridge Land and Title. R. Clemens, proprietor. She walked toward it with the kind of purpose that comes from having nowhere to retreat to. Inside the land office, Raymond Clemens was doing what Raymond Clemens did most afternoons, sitting behind a desk that was too large for the room, reading week-old newspapers from Santa Fe, and developing strong opinions about events he couldn't influence. He was 62, heavy, and had the mustache of a man who'd decided 30 years ago that his mustache was his most distinguished feature and had been nurturing it with that conviction ever since. The bell above the door announced her arrival. He looked up, took her in over the top of his reading spectacles, set the newspaper down slowly. "Help you?" "My name is Elena Mercer," she said. "I have a letter from a Mr. Albert Hale. He wrote to the placement agency in Denver on behalf of his son Gideon Hale, regarding a domestic position." She placed the letter on his desk. Clemens looked at the letter without touching it. His expression shifted in a way that was difficult to read, something between recognition and discomfort. "Albert Hale died 6 weeks ago," he said. A pause. "I see," Elena said. "And Gideon Hale?" "Still out at the ranch." He finally picked up the letter, unfolded it, scanned it. His mustache moved. "Albert wrote this before he passed. Didn't... He folded it again, handed it back to her. "Thing is, Miss Mercer, I don't know if Gideon is still looking for someone. His father made the arrangements, not him. I'm not sure Gideon even knows you're coming. The agency received payment," she said. "That was sufficient for me to make the journey." "Yes, well." Clemens leaned back in his chair, which creaked under the redistribution of his weight. He studied her with the slightly guilty look of a man who's about to say something unkind and knows it. "Let me be straight with you, because I'm afraid nobody else in this town will bother. Gideon Hale lost his wife 14 months ago. Clara. She was well liked. The children, there are two of them, a boy and a girl. Since Clara passed, Gideon's been struggling. There have been two women from town who tried to help with the household. One lasted 11 days. The other lasted 3. What happened to them? Nothing dramatic. He didn't make it easy to help him. And the children, he paused. Especially the boy, Thomas. He's 12, and he's... Another pause, longer this time, as though he was searching for the right word. He's decided that the best way to handle what happened to his family is to make himself as unpleasant as possible to everyone around him. And the girl? Lily is 7. She's quieter about it. He said this in a way that suggested quiet grief was perhaps the more worrying kind. Elena absorbed all of this. She looked down at the letter in her hand, then back at Clemens. How far is the ranch? 3 miles east. I can have someone... I'll walk. He blinked. It's 6 o'clock in the evening. It's still 90 degrees out there. Then I'd better start walking, she said, and turned toward the door. Miss Mercer. She stopped. He was struggling with something, she could tell. Some obligation of honesty wrestling with some instinct for self-preservation. Honesty won, barely. The boy threw a water pitcher at the last woman, caught her on the shoulder, just so you know what you're walking into. She considered this information. Was it a full pitcher or an empty one? He stared at her. Does that matter? It tells me whether he was aiming to hurt her or just trying to make her leave. Clemens had no answer for that. Elena nodded once, as if she'd made some private calculation, and walked back out into the heat. The road east out of Briar Ridge was a pale dirt track that wound between scrub brush and dried grass, with the mesa rising to the north and the low flat desert stretching south toward the horizon. The sun was beginning its long descent, and the light had turned that particular amber color that makes even desolate landscapes look briefly beautiful, though Elena was too hot and too focused on the road ahead to notice the beauty much. She'd done this before. Not this exactly. Not this specific version of arriving somewhere difficult, but something like it. She'd grown up in the kind of circumstances that teach you early that you cannot wait for situations to improve on their own. You find the work that needs doing, and you do it, and you try not to think too much about whether you'll get thanked for it. Her mother had died when Elena was 9. Her father had remarried quickly and unhappily, which created a household full of resentment and noise that nobody knew how to manage. Elena had learned to cook, to clean, to organize, to anticipate. Not because anyone asked her to, but because it gave her a place in the structure of things. A reason to be present, a function. She was not, she would be the first to admit, a romantic person. She had no particular illusions about what awaited her at the Hale Ranch. A difficult man, a damaged household, 2 children who were probably angry in the specific way that children become angry when something enormous has been taken from them and nobody around them knows what to say. She dealt with worse. Or so she told herself, walking through the heat with her canvas bag bumping against her leg. The ranch appeared when the road curved around a low rise. And Elena's first thought, if she was honest, was that it looked the way a sigh felt. Not ruined exactly, not collapsed, just released, like a place that had given up the effort of maintaining appearances. The fences needed repair. Several boards on the corral gate had warped and split. The vegetable patch to the side of the house was barely a vegetable patch anymore, more of a memorial to the idea of vegetables. The house itself was a solid enough structure, 2 stories of adobe and timber, but the whitewash was peeling, and one of the shutters hung at an angle that suggested its hinges had been meaning to fail for some time and had recently made their decision. There were 2 horses in the corral, both watching her approach with what seemed like professional indifference. A barn sat behind the house, its doors open, one of them swinging slightly in the evening wind. No sign of people. Elena stood at the base of the porch steps for a moment and looked at the front door, which was closed despite the heat. She thought about what Clemens had told her. Then she climbed the steps, raised her hand, and knocked. Silence. She knocked again. From somewhere inside came the sound of movement, something being set down, or knocked over, hard to tell, and then footsteps. The door opened. Gideon Hale was not what she'd been expecting, though she wouldn't have been able to say precisely what she had been expecting. He was taller than he'd pictured, with the build of someone who'd spent his whole life doing physical work. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, forearms roped with muscle under rolled sleeves. He was 40 or close to it, with dark hair shot through with premature gray at the temples, and a jaw that hadn't been properly shaved in at least a week. His eyes were brown and direct, and at this particular moment profoundly unwelcoming. He looked at her the way you look at something you weren't prepared to deal with. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I'm Elena Mercer, from the Denver Domestic Placement Agency. Your father arranged—" "I know what my father arranged," he said. His voice was low and flat, and he said it the way people say things they've been quietly angry about for a while. "I just didn't think anyone would actually show up." "Your father paid the placement fee. My father was an optimist." He said this without humor. "And now he's dead." A long pause stretched between them. Behind him, somewhere in the house, Elena could hear the creak of a floorboard, small feet trying to be quiet. "I understand you've had a difficult year," she said. Something moved across his face, not anger exactly, more like the brief flinch of someone who's learned to expect platitudes and is already bracing against this one. "Is that what they're calling it?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not going to pretend I know what it's been like for your family," she said. "I wouldn't insult you with that. But I've come a long way, and I'm good at what I do. And if you'll let me, I can help with the household." She held his gaze. "You don't have to like me or trust me. You just have to let me in the door." He looked at her for a long moment, looked at the bag in her hand, looked back at her face. He seemed to be doing some calculation she couldn't read. Then he stepped aside. It wasn't gracious. It wasn't welcoming. It was just a man moving out of a doorway. But it was enough. The inside of the house confirmed what the outside had suggested. The front room held a table, 4 chairs, a stone fireplace cold with old ash, and a general atmosphere of disorder that had settled in so completely it had started to feel like decoration. There were dishes stacked near the basin that hadn't been dealt with. The floor had been swept recently, but not well. A pile of mending sat on one of the chairs in the corner, shirts and trousers in various stages of needing attention, and had clearly been sitting there long enough that a layer of dust had settled on top of it. The smell was the smell of a house that had forgotten what regular cooking was. Something stale underneath. Old grease. Dust. But she'd seen worse. Standing at the entrance to the hallway were 2 children framed in the low light, watching her with completely different expressions. The girl was small for 7, with her father's dark hair worn in 2 uneven braids that Elena could tell had been done by someone who didn't have much practice with braiding. Probably the girl herself, she guessed. Her face was cautious and large-eyed, and she held one hand in the other the way children do when they're trying not to fidget. She was looking at Elena with the careful, measuring look of a child who has learned to assess situations quickly. The boy was 12, and tall for it, all angular elbows and the beginning of the height that would make him a big man someday. His resemblance to his father was unmistakable. He had the same jaw, the same directness in his eyes, except where his father's eyes were reluctant and exhausted, Thomas's were simply hostile. He was staring at Elena with his arms folded across his chest, in the exact posture of a person who has already decided the outcome of a situation and is just waiting for the world to catch up. "Thomas," Gideon said quietly. "Lily, this is Miss Mercer." Lily gave the smallest possible wave, just 2 fingers lifting slightly from her clasped hands. Thomas said nothing. His gaze traveled from Elena's face down to her bag and back up again, slow and deliberately unimpressed. Elena had been stared at by 12-year-olds before. She didn't look away. "Hello," she said, addressing both of them but holding Thomas's gaze. "I know I'm a stranger. You don't have to be happy about this." She glanced at Lily. "Either of you." Lily's expression shifted, something halfway toward relief, as though she'd been prepared for a more elaborate performance of cheerfulness and was grateful not to have to witness one. Thomas remained unmoved. "The last one cried," he said, "on the 3rd day. She cried in the kitchen and then she left." "Thomas," Gideon started. "I'm just telling her," Thomas said, without looking at his father. "Thank you for the warning," Elena said. He hadn't expected that. Something in his jaw shifted, just slightly, before he reset his expression to neutral. Gideon showed her to the small room at the back of the house that had apparently been designated for this purpose. It was barely a room, more of a closed-in space that had once been storage and still hadn't fully committed to its new identity. There was a narrow bed, a window that looked out on the corral, a hook on the wall for hanging clothes, and a washstand in the corner. The mattress was thin, but the linens were clean, which told her someone had at least made an effort. "It's not much," Gideon said, standing in the doorway. "It's sufficient," she said, setting her bag on the bed. He watched her do it with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his default, that quality of a man observing something he's uncertain how to feel about. "Breakfast is early. I'm out before 6. I'll be up before you are." A pause. "You don't have to." "Mr. Hale." She turned and looked at him directly. "I know this isn't what you planned for. Your father made arrangements you weren't consulted on, and now there's a stranger in your house. And I understand that's uncomfortable, but your children looked like they haven't eaten a proper meal in some time. So rather than talk about logistics tonight, why don't I see what's in your kitchen and put something together for supper?" He looked at her like he was about to argue. Then some of the resistance in his face loosened just slightly. "There's not much," he said. "Some flour, salt pork, maybe some dried beans." "That's enough," she said, and walked past him toward the kitchen. There's a particular kind of silence that lives in a kitchen where nobody has really cooked in a long time. Not just quiet, something more deliberate than that. It's the silence of a place that's been maintaining a respectful distance from the life it was built to support. Elena stood in the Hale kitchen and took stock. It was not, on the surface, a disaster. The room was structurally sound. A good iron stove, a solid work counter, deep shelves along one wall. Someone had cleaned it, or tried to, at some point in the recent past. But the stove's firebox was cold and hadn't been lit in at least a day, maybe 2. The pantry held the flour Gideon had mentioned, a partial sack of cornmeal, the salt pork wrapped in cloth, a few potatoes that were still edible if you were selective about which parts you used, half a jar of dried beans, and a tin of lard. In a house with 2 children and a grown man who worked physical labor from sunup to sundown, this was not enough food. This was barely enough food for a single person to get through a couple of days. Elena stood in front of the pantry shelves for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She was making a list in her head, not just of what was missing from the pantry, but of what was missing from the house entirely. Warmth, routine, the sound of someone moving around the kitchen at a time of day when it made sense for someone to be moving around a kitchen. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She got the stove lit first, which required cleaning out the old ash and finding the kindling box by the back door and negotiating with Flint that hadn't been used regularly enough and had developed an attitude about it. The first 3 attempts produced smoke and frustration. The 4th caught. She wasn't the kind of person who celebrated small victories out loud, but she felt the small satisfaction of the flame taking hold and settling in. While the stove heated, she put the beans to soak. They'd be for tomorrow, not tonight, but soaking them now was practical. She rendered the salt pork in the pan and used the fat to start a corn cake. She peeled and sliced the best of the potatoes, fried them with what onion she found in the vegetable box outside the back door. It wasn't a remarkable meal. It was what it was. Honest food, food that filled bellies, food that came together because someone had put thought and effort into it instead of just waiting for it to appear. The smell changed the house. She noticed it happen. That particular alchemy of food cooking on a stove, the fat, the corn, the warmth coming off the cast iron, it traveled through walls in a way that cold kitchens don't. She heard movement upstairs, then smaller footsteps on the stairs. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She stood there for a full minute, not speaking, just watching Elena work with those large, careful eyes. "Do you need something?" Elena asked, not looking up from the pan. "No," Lily said. A pause. "What is that smell?" "Cornbread and fried potatoes." Another pause. Can I come in?" Elena looked up then. The girl was holding the door frame with one hand half in and half out, as if she hadn't quite decided whether it was safe to commit to entering. "This is your kitchen," Elena said. "You don't need to ask me if you can come in." Something about this answer seemed to genuinely surprise Lily. She came in. She pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down at the table and put her chin in her hands and watched Elena finish the corn cake with the focused attention of someone they've been waiting a long time to see. "The other ladies cried?" Elena asked after a while. "Miss Henderson cried," Lily confirmed. "Mrs. Warren didn't cry. She and Thomas had an argument, and then she packed her things." A pause. "Thomas says bad words sometimes. A lot of 12-year-old boys do." "He didn't used to," Lily said, and she said it in the quiet, matter-of-fact way of a 7-year-old reporting a fact about the world that she found genuinely puzzling, like he'd been replaced by something else, and she was still in the process of figuring out what. Elena turned the corn cake in the pan. "Where's your brother now?" "Upstairs. He smells the food. He won't come down first." "Why not?" Lily thought about this. "Because then it would seem like he cared about the food." She said it like this was the most obvious thing in the world. Thomas doesn't like seeming like he cares about things. And does he care about things? Or about a very long pause. "He cried for 3 days, Lily said quietly. "After Mama. And then he stopped and he hasn't cried since. Papa thinks Thomas is doing better, but I don't think crying stopping means you're doing better. I think sometimes it means something else." Elena set the pan to the side of the stove and looked at the girl. 7 years old, making observations like that. "I think you're probably right," she said. Lily looked up from her chin in hands position. "Really?" "Really." Lily seemed to absorb this with some private satisfaction and went back to watching the cornbread. Gideon came in from the barn when the light had gone completely out of the sky. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and took in the scene. The lamp lit on the table, 3 plates set out, steam rising from the food in the center, Lily sitting at the table already with her hands in her lap in an imitation of patience that suggested she was working hard at it. No Thomas, not yet. Gideon's face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, something softer that he folded back up almost immediately, a kind of careful neutrality that was clearly practiced. "Supper's ready," Elena said, unnecessarily. "I see that." He stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure he was allowed to come in. His own kitchen. He looked at the food. "You found enough?" "Enough for tonight. We'll need to resupply tomorrow." Write me a list of what you need from town and I'll arrange it." She pulled out the chair across from Lily. "Come sit down." He came and sat, which she suspected was something he did more on autopilot than from any particular willingness, because he was clearly the kind of man who sat at his own table without needing to be told. It was just that someone had said it first, and his body had responded before his pride could object. They sat in the quiet for a moment. Lily, Gideon, Elena, and the empty chair where Thomas wasn't. Gideon looked at the empty chair. "Thomas!" he called toward the ceiling. Silence from upstairs. "Thomas, supper." More silence. Then eventually the slow and deliberate sound of someone taking their time on the stairs, making sure it was clear that the timing of their arrival was entirely their own choice. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had clearly done something to his hair since earlier, roughed it up maybe, into a posture of not having cared. He looked at the table, looked at Elena, looked at the food, looked back at Elena with an expression that was doing a lot of work to communicate that this was all beneath his notice. Then he came and sat down. He ate without saying anything, but he ate. That was the thing Elena noted. He ate steadily and without stopping, and she watched from the corner of her eye as he finished what was on his plate and slowed down only when it was clear there was no more. And even then he looked at the empty serving dish with a single unguarded moment of something that was almost disappointment before he looked away. He was hungry. He'd been hungry for a while. Gideon watched his son without appearing to watch his son, and said nothing. Lily ate everything on her plate and then asked, very politely, if she could have the last piece of cornbread, and Elena said yes, and Lily took it with the reverence of someone who has not had something they wanted very much in a long time. "It's good," Lily said between bites. Thomas looked at his empty plate. "Yeah," he said. Then, as if he'd caught himself doing something he hadn't intended, he pushed his chair back. "It's fine," he corrected, and went upstairs. Elena kept her expression neutral. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, as if it cost him something to say, He hasn't eaten like that in... It's been a while. How long has food been short? A pause. Things have been tight since spring. And you didn't... She stopped herself, recalibrated. Is there anyone in town who could have helped? Extended credit? I don't take charity. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. Mr. Hale, she said, careful but direct. Your children are hungry. That's not a moral failing on your part, but it does need to be solved. His jaw tightened. She could see the argument building in him, the pride-driven objection, the practiced speech about managing his own affairs. Then it seemed to exhaust itself before it fully formed. He looked tired. Not just tonight tired, but something longer and deeper than that. The kind of tired that settles into a person's bones after months of fighting alone. I know, he said quietly. Just that. I know. Elena nodded. Then we'll work on solving it, she said, and stood to clear the plates. That first night after the children were in bed and Gideon had retreated to wherever in the house he went to be alone with whatever he carried, Elena sat at the kitchen table in the near dark with a cold cup of coffee and a piece of paper and wrote out a practical list. Supplies needed, repairs needed, meals for the week given what was available, questions about the ranch's income, the state of the crops, the debts outstanding. She was practical by nature. She dealt with what was in front of her, in the order it needed dealing with. But she also sat with the weight of what Lily had said. He cried for 3 days, and then he stopped. And I don't think stopping means you're doing better. I think sometimes it means something else. 7 years old. Elena looked at the list she'd made, looked past it, through the wall and up through the ceiling in the general direction of where she imagined Thomas's room to be. A 12-year-old boy who had decided the safest way to survive grief was to make himself impossible to reach. She didn't know yet what to do about that, but she filed it away. The way she filed things, quietly, carefully, in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. Tomorrow she would light the stove again. She would make something better than tonight's dinner because she'd know more about what was available. She would start on the mending pile because the children needed clothes they could actually wear. She would take stock of what the ranch needed and what it had, and begin to work out the distance between those two things. She would do the work that needed doing. That was what she knew how to do. Outside, the July wind moved through the scrub brush and the stars over the mesa were enormous and close, the way they get in high desert when there's no moisture in the air to blur them. The house made the small sounds old houses make at night, settling into itself. Elena folded her list, put it in her apron pocket, rinsed her cup. The drought hadn't broken. The ranch was still struggling. Gideon Hale was still a man carrying a weight he'd never been taught to put down. Thomas was still upstairs, somewhere between grief and rage and armor. Lily was still a child doing the quiet, unasked-for work of paying attention to everyone around her. None of that had changed. But the stove had been lit. And sometimes, Elena knew from long experience, that's where you have to start. She was up before dawn. The house was dark and the air had cooled enough overnight that she was glad of it. She got the stove going before the sky had shown any color and had coffee on by the time the horizon began to lighten to the east. She found a partial jar of honey she'd missed the night before in the back of the pantry and used it on the cornmeal mush she made because it was what she had, and it was hot, and it was food. She heard Gideon before she saw him. His boots on the stairs, the pause at the bottom, the brief hesitation outside the kitchen door. He appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his hair damp from washing and a look on his face like a man who doesn't know the rules of the situation he's walked into. "Coffee's on the stove," she said. He crossed to it, poured a cup, stood at the window looking out at the corral and the lightening sky beyond, and whatever thoughts men have standing at their kitchen windows in the early morning. "You didn't have to be up this early," he said. "You're out before 6. If I'm making breakfast, I need to be up before 6. A pause. "The children don't usually eat before I go. They will from now on." She didn't say it aggressively, just factually, the way she said most things. Lily especially. Growing children need regular meals. He turned from the window and looked at her. In the early light, with the lamp on the table between them, she could see more of his face than she'd been able to the previous evening. The lines of it. The exhaustion she'd sensed in him the night before was visible now. Not just in his eyes, but in the set of his shoulders, The way he held his coffee cup like it was partly a pretext for having something to hold. "You're very direct," he said. Not quite a complaint, more of something in him almost relaxed. Not quite a smile, but a slight loosening around his mouth, like a door that was briefly considered before the lock held. "What do you need from town?" he asked. "For supplies." "I made a list." She handed it to him. He read it, his brow furrowed slightly at certain items. "I know it's a longer list than you were expecting. I was going to say it's very organized." "Oh." A small pause. "I can add to it if I think of anything else." He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket. Finished his coffee, took the bowl of mush she put in front of him without apparent objection, and ate it standing at the counter, looking out the window at the corral, where the two horses were beginning to stir in the early light. He rinsed his own bowl, put it on the counter. "I'll be back by supper," he said. "All right." He put his hat on, picked up his gloves from the hook by the back door, and paused there for a moment with his hand on the latch. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something. He decided against it, in the end, and went out into the morning. Elena watched the door close. Then she turned back to the stove and the second day. Thomas came downstairs at 7:30. She heard him before she saw him. The particular weight of his footsteps, heavier than a child should need to be on their own stairs, landing with a deliberateness that was probably meant to communicate something, but mostly just communicated that he was 12. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She didn't look up from the bread dough she was working. He stood there for a moment, clearly expecting her to look up, or say something, or acknowledge him in some way that he could then respond to. She did none of these things. He came in and sat down at the table, pulled the chair out with more noise than was necessary. She put a bowl of cornmeal mush in front of him, honey jar beside it. He looked at the honey jar. This was clearly not what he'd expected to find on the table. He looked at her with something that was trying to be suspicion, but might have had some curiosity in it. "Go ahead," she said. "It won't bite you." A long pause. Then he took the honey jar and used it, with studied nonchalance, as if honey had always been available and he simply chose sometimes to use it. He ate in silence. She worked in silence. After a while, "The well pump sticks," he said. She looked up. He was staring at his bowl, not at her, eating. "Third handle turn, it sticks. You have to lift up on it when you push down. Otherwise, you're just there forever." She looked at him. He still wasn't looking at her. "Thank you," she said. "I'll remember that." He gave a shrug that was meant to convey total indifference. Then he finished his breakfast and took his bowl to the basin, rinsed it, she noticed, and set it on the counter, and went back upstairs. Elena looked at the basin where he'd left his rinsed bowl. She added it to her mental file, the one where she kept the things that mattered. Yet, by the end of the first week, Elena had established certain things. The morning routine was fixed: fire lit before dawn, coffee ready when Gideon came down, breakfast on the table by the time the children appeared. Gideon still ate quickly and in silence, but he ate. The children ate. This seemed like a small thing, and was not a small thing. The mending pile had been reduced by half. Thomas had needed the repair work on his boots most urgently. The sole on the left one had been separating, which explained the way he walked with a slight favoring of his right foot that she'd noticed on the first day. She'd worked on the boots 2 evenings in a row and left them by his door. He hadn't said anything about it, but she'd seen him wearing them the next morning with the care of someone who understood that something had been done for them. The vegetable patch was not beyond saving. It needed water and attention, but there were things still alive in it that could be coaxed back with enough care. She'd started on it 3 days in, working in the morning before the heat became unworkable, and Lily had materialized at her elbow on the second day of this project with a small pair of gardening gloves and an expression of cautious willingness. "I helped Mama in the garden," Lily had said, by way of explanation. "I could use help," Elena had said, by way of invitation. They'd worked side by side in the early morning, not talking much. Lily, because she was concentrating on doing things correctly. Elena, because she'd found the girl worked better when she wasn't being directed. She figured things out herself, watched what needed doing, and did it. It was a quality Elena recognized and respected. Thomas kept his distance. He did his chores. He had them, Gideon had made clear, and he did them without being asked twice, which was something. But he did them at times and in patterns that carefully did not intersect with wherever Elena was working. She let him. She understood what he was doing. He needed to feel like he was maintaining some control over the geography of his own life. And as long as he was eating and doing his chores, the geography question was negotiable. On Thursday of the first week, she was in the barn looking for something to use to patch the fence along the north side of the corral. She'd found the loose boards 2 days ago, and it had been bothering her. When she heard a sound from the hayloft above her, she stopped, listened. It was quiet, then not quite quiet. The rustle of movement up there, the adjustment of weight on old boards. "I'm not coming up there," she said into the air of the barn. "But I know you're there." A pause. "I come here sometimes," Thomas said from the hayloft. Defensive, like he was daring her to object. "I wasn't planning to tell you not to," she said. Another pause, longer. "The last one told my father that I was spending too much time alone." She might have had a point, Elena said carefully, but she said it the wrong way. Silence from above. She found a hammer and the box of nails she'd been looking for on the workbench and started back toward the barn door. "Miss Mercer." She stopped. "What did you do?" A pause that seemed to be clarifying itself. "Before. What did you do before you came here?" She thought about how to answer this. She had a sense he wanted a real answer, not a rehearsed one. "I worked for a family in Colorado for 3 years," she said. "2 boys, older than you. Before that, a widow in Kansas with 4 children. Before that, a few different things." She paused. "I've been doing this work for a long time." "Because you don't have anywhere else to go?" The question was pointed and deliberate and slightly cruel, the way 12-year-olds can be when they're looking for information and haven't yet learned the more careful ways of looking for it. She considered just answering honestly. "Because I'm good at it," she said, "and because it matters." A long silence. She went back out to fix the fence. At the end of the first week, on Friday evening, she sat at the kitchen table after supper. The children upstairs, Gideon somewhere out back, the lamp turned low, and added up what she knew. The ranch was in debt, but not catastrophically so. The drought had hurt the hay crop badly, which affected what they could bring to market, which affected everything downstream from that. There were things she couldn't fix because she didn't have authority over them, and things she couldn't fix because they weren't the kind of things that could be fixed by anyone. But there was enough, she thought, to work with. The house was in better shape after 7 days. Not good. She was realistic. But better. The mending was down to the last few pieces. The kitchen was running on a system now rather than improvisation. The pantry had food in it, real food, enough to cook with. And the family. She sat with her hands around her coffee cup and thought about what she'd seen in the first week. Gideon Hale, who ate everything she put in front of him without complaint and thanked her briefly every evening and had still not asked her a single personal question, as though the fact of her presence was easier to manage if she remained somewhat abstract. Lily, who had blossomed in the garden within 3 days and who had started, by the end of the week, to come to Elena in the kitchen after supper without needing a reason, just appearing and sitting and talking about small things, the horses, the neighbor's dogs she could hear from her window at night, a bird that had been visiting the garden. Thomas, who still kept his distance but had rinsed his own dishes 3 times now, and once, just once, on Wednesday, had paused behind her at the stove where she was making soup and said, without being asked, that the soup smelled like something his mother used to make, and then immediately left the room before she could respond, as if he'd accidentally revealed something he'd meant to keep. It was something. She finished her coffee and went to bed. The house settled around her in the dark, making its small sounds. The wind outside, the horses in the corral, the ordinary particular music of a household at rest. 7 days. She had no idea what came next. Not specifically, not in the ways that would matter. She didn't know what December would look like, or October, or even next week. She didn't know if Gideon would ever talk to her as a person rather than a fixture. She didn't know if Thomas would lower his guard before something made it worse. She knew that the stove had been lit for 7 mornings in a row. She knew that 2 children had eaten 3 meals a day for 7 days. She knew the fence along the north corral was fixed. She lay in the dark in the small back room that smelled like old wood and the faint, clean smell of the night desert coming through the window, and she listened to the house breathe around her. It was a start. It was enough. The second week started with a dead chicken. Elena found it in the coop on Monday morning, lying on its side in the corner with the particular stillness of something that had not died quickly or well. She stood in the coop doorway and looked at it for a moment, then looked at the other 5 hens who were watching her with the blank professional suspicion of chickens everywhere. She went and found Gideon in the barn. "One of your hens is dead," she said. "The one with the gray marking on her wing." He looked up from the harness he was working on. Something passed across his face. "Marigold," he said. A pause. "You named them." "Clara named them." He said it without changing his expression, the way people say things that have had all the feeling worn out of them by repetition. He set the harness down and stood. "I'll take care of it." "I already moved her," Elena said. "She's outside the coop. But I wanted to check, is there illness in the flock? Is this something I should be worried about for the others?" He followed her to the coop and looked at the dead hen where Elena had laid her in the shade by the fence. He crouched down and checked her over with practiced hands. No, she was old. He stood. "She's been old for a while." He took the hen away, and Elena went back to the kitchen, and that was the whole conversation. But she'd heard it. The particular way he'd said Clara named them, like a sentence that used to have more words attached to it and had been shortened over time until only the essential part remained. Not because the rest didn't matter. Because the rest had gotten too heavy to carry all the way to the end. She thought about Clara Hale more than she'd expected to. Not in a consuming way, not in a way she'd have admitted to Gideon or anyone else, but in the practical, observational way she thought about most things. The woman was everywhere in this house, in the way that the dead are everywhere in the places they loved. In the pattern of the kitchen curtains, in the particular spot on the shelf where the good dishes were kept slightly apart from the everyday ones, in the names of the chickens and the way Lily braided her own hair, the same crooked way every morning because someone had taught her, and she'd never stopped. Clara had been someone who named things and kept the good dishes separate and taught her daughter to braid, and now she was gone, and the house had been trying and failing to reorganize itself around that absence for 14 months. Elena was not trying to replace her. She was clear on that, inside herself. She was trying to give the house a function again, which was different, but she was also careful about where she put things, and whose spaces she was entering, and what she was altering. You couldn't be careless about that kind of thing. You couldn't just move in and start rearranging, not in a house where grief had taken up permanent residence and was particular about its furniture. The third week brought the first real conflict. It started with the laundry, specifically with Thomas's refusal to bring his laundry down from his room on the day she'd designated for washing. She asked him once at breakfast. He said he'd do it. By mid-morning, nothing had appeared. She went to the foot of the stairs. "Thomas, the laundry." "I said I'd do it." "I need it now if it's going to dry before evening." A long pause from upstairs. "It's my room." She stood at the bottom of the stairs and chose her words with the care of someone who understood that this particular standoff was not actually about laundry. "You're right," she said. "It is. I'm not going in your room. I'm asking you to bring what needs washing to the top of the stairs, and I'll take it from there." Silence. "Or you can wash it yourself," she added. "Those are your options." She went back to the kitchen. She gave it 10 minutes. Then she heard him on the stairs, slow and deliberate, and a pile of shirts and trousers appeared at the bottom landing. He was gone again before she came to collect it. She looked at the pile on the floor for a moment. It was a compromise, and it wasn't pretty, and he'd done it in the most graceless way available to him, but he'd done it. She picked it up and added it to the wash. Gideon had been watching from the kitchen doorway. She hadn't known he was there until she turned around. "You're patient," he said. Not quite a compliment. More like something he was observing and hadn't fully categorized yet. "He needs to feel like he has some authority over something," she said. "He's 12 and his whole world went sideways. The laundry is a small thing." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "The last, Mrs. Warren. She and Thomas had an argument about his tone. She told him he was disrespectful and he needed to mind himself." "Was she wrong?" He hesitated. "No, but she made him choose between his pride and her presence," Elena said, "and he chose his pride, which is exactly what you'd expect a grieving 12-year-old to do." She picked up the laundry basket. "I'm not trying to win arguments with him. I'm trying to outlast his certainty that I'm going to leave." Gideon looked at her for a long moment with that expression she'd started to recognize, the one where he was recalibrating something, adjusting some assumption he'd been operating on. "What made you good at this?" he asked. It was the first personal question he'd asked her. She considered it honestly. "I grew up in a house where nobody knew how to talk to each other," she said. "So I learned to pay attention to what people weren't saying." He nodded slowly. She couldn't tell what he did with that, and he didn't offer anything in return, and she didn't expect him to. It was August now, and the drought showed no sign of breaking. The creek was still dry, the fields east of the ranch were cracked and pale as old bone, and the mood in Briar Ridge when Elena made her weekly trip to town for supplies was the mood of people conserving their energy for a long endurance. She had started to know people, in the way you know people in small towns, not intimately, but by their patterns and their faces, and the particular way they talked around the things they were actually thinking about. Harlan at the feed store was worried about his inventory and showed it by being more talkative than necessary. Mildred Crane at the dry goods store had formed some opinion about Elena's presence at the Hale Ranch and showed it by being slightly too pleasant in a way that had information underneath it. "How are you finding it out there, Mildred asked, on the third week's supply run, in the particular tone of a woman who is asking several questions at once. "The work suits me," Elena said, reading the list she'd brought. "Gideon Hale is a—" Mildred paused, searching for the right word. "He can be a difficult man. He doesn't take well to help. I've noticed." Clara was the one who— Another pause. The sentence clearly had a direction that Mildred then thought better of. She was just good with him. She knew how to manage him, I suppose. Elena looked up from her list. "I'm not managing him," she said, mild but clear. "I'm running his household while he runs his ranch." Mildred blinked. "Of course," she said, faintly chastened, and went to pull the flour from the shelf. Elena went back to her list. She was not annoyed exactly. She understood what Mildred was doing, trying to triangulate, to understand what Elena's presence meant for a household the town had been watching with concern, and she suspected a certain amount of judgment. What was this woman's role? What were her intentions? Was she an appropriate person to have around the Hale children? The questions were fair in their way. She just didn't see any profit in answering them. What she'd found in the weeks since her arrival was that the Hale household had a problem that went deeper than empty pantries and mending piles. The pantry and the mending pile were things she could solve. The real problem was what Lily had identified that first night with the clear vision of a child who'd been paying close attention to everything. Thomas had stopped crying, and that meant something. Grief in that house had taken 3 distinct shapes, and none of them were talking to each other. Gideon's grief was a room he lived in alone and locked from the inside. She could see it in how he spoke about Clara, or rather, in how he didn't. In how he'd said Marigold when she'd told him about the chicken, as if the name had cost him something to produce. He'd built a life that functioned around the edges of the loss without ever going near the center of it, and he'd been doing it for so long that he'd probably convinced himself the arrangement was sustainable. Thomas's grief had calcified into anger, which was safer than grief because anger had a direction. You could aim anger. Grief just sat on you and you couldn't do anything with it. She'd seen children do this before, take the shapeless weight of loss and press it into something harder and more manageable. The problem was what it cost them. The softness that went missing in the process. The Lily had described, crying for 3 days and then stopping, that was the sound of a door closing. And Lily's grief was perhaps the most careful of all, watchful, observant, held close to the chest. She'd adapted. Children adapt. It's what they do. But adaptation at 7 shouldn't look like that kind of vigilance. Shouldn't involve watching the adults around you this carefully and assessing the situation this accurately. Lily was 7 years old and she'd already learned that it wasn't safe to need too much. Elena thought about this on the drives back from town, the wagon horse plodding east through the heat, and she did not come up with solutions because she didn't have solutions. She had patience and she had consistency and she had the absolute willingness to stay, and she had learned, across years of this kind of work, that sometimes those things were enough and sometimes they weren't, and the only way to find out was to keep showing up. It was mid-August when Thomas came to find her. She was at the kitchen table in the late afternoon, mending the last few items from the pile. His pile, actually, the shirt she'd collected from the bottom of the stairs. He came in through the back door and stood there in the kitchen with dirt on his knees and a look on his face that was fighting hard to be neutral and losing slightly. "I broke the fence side of the vegetable garden," he said. "The post. It doesn't matter how. It's broken." She looked at him. He was staring at a point somewhere to the left of her face. "All right," she said. "I can fix it," he said quickly. "I just need to know where the extra posts are." "Barn," she said. "Back left corner behind the hay bales. There should be a mallet there, too." He nodded, turned to go. "Thomas." He stopped. "Do you know how to set a post properly?" A pause that lasted one beat too long. "Yes," he said, and it was about 60% convincing. "There's a particular way to tamp the soil back in after," she said. "So it holds. Do you want me to show you?" The pause this time was different, shorter and more complicated. "It's a fence post," he said. "It's not complicated." "You're right, it's not," she agreed. "I'm going to come out anyway because I need to check on the east side of the garden." She set down the mending and followed him out to the garden, where the broken post was lying at an angle that suggested it had been involved in some kind of impact. She didn't ask, as promised. They got the replacement post from the barn. She showed him how to set it without appearing to show him, talking about the garden while her hands demonstrated the depth and the tamping and the angle, letting him replicate it while she was technically looking elsewhere. He got it right. She could tell he knew he'd gotten it right because something in his posture shifted when the post stood solid. "That'll hold," she said, testing it. He wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at the post with the satisfaction of someone who is working hard not to look satisfied. "Why do you do that?" he said abruptly. "Do what?" "Pretend you're not showing me things when you are." She looked at him. He was looking directly at her now. That Gideon directness. The same brown eyes with a different kind of heat in them. "Because you learn better when you think you're figuring it out yourself," she said. He stared at her. He seemed to be deciding whether this was insulting or not. Then something in his face shifted into something she hadn't seen from him before. Not warmth exactly. More like the brief, reluctant expression of a person who has been understood in a way they weren't expecting. "My mother used to do that," he said. And then he picked up the mallet and walked back to the barn, and the moment closed behind him like water. She stood in the garden for a moment after he was gone. There it was. There was the thing underneath everything. Not anger, not hostility, just a boy who'd had someone who knew exactly how he worked and lost her, and was going through the world since then feeling not quite understood by anyone, and not knowing how to say it, and so expressing it instead as general unwillingness. She went back inside and finished the mending. That evening at supper, Thomas passed the salt to Lily before she asked for it. It was a small thing, nobody commented on it, but Elena saw Gideon see it, and she saw something move across his face that was too complicated and too private to name. The problem with the ranch's finances crystallized at the end of August. She'd been piecing it together for weeks, from what Gideon mentioned in passing, from the invoices she'd found tucked behind the pantry shelf that she suspected he'd put there so he wouldn't have to look at them, from the simple arithmetic of what the ranch was producing versus what it needed to function. The picture it added up to was not good, not catastrophic, not yet, but the path from not good to catastrophic was shorter than Gideon seemed willing to acknowledge. She brought it up on a Tuesday evening when the children were in bed. She'd been waiting for a moment when he was tired enough to be honest. She put a cup of coffee in front of him at the kitchen table and sat down across from him with the invoices. He looked at them, looked at her. Something in his jaw set. "Where did you—" "Behind the pantry shelf," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him deciding whether to be angry about it. "I wasn't hiding them," he said finally. "I know." She didn't elaborate on how she knew, which was that a man who is hiding something doesn't hide it somewhere that a woman cleaning his kitchen will find it in 2 weeks. He'd put them there because he couldn't deal with them and didn't know where else to put something he couldn't deal with. "The hay crop this year," he started, "is about 40% of what you need," she said. "I worked it out from the acreage and the invoices. You've got enough to get through to the first frost, but if fall doesn't bring more rain, next spring is going to be a serious problem." He stared at the invoices. "I know that. Is there anything that could be sold or leased in the meantime? Land, stock? I'm not selling any part of this ranch." He said it without heat, like a position he'd held so long it had gone past emotion and become simply fact. "I'm not suggesting you sell it," she said. "I'm asking if there are options." He was quiet. His thumb moved along the rim of his coffee cup. "There's a grazing parcel on the north side. I haven't been using it. Henderson mentioned his herd last spring, but He stopped. "You didn't follow up on it." "I had other things." He stopped again, and she could see him recognizing in real time that other things wasn't quite the true explanation. The true explanation was something closer to he hadn't followed up on it because following up on things required a forward-looking orientation that had been very hard to maintain for the past 14 months. "Talk to Henderson," Elena said. "A grazing lease on land you're not using would get you through the winter without touching anything permanent." He looked at her, then at the invoices, then at some middle distance where he appeared to be doing calculations. "You're running the finances of my ranch," he said. Not angry. More like he was narrating it to himself to see how it sounded. "I'm trying to make sure your children have food next spring," she said. "You can call it whatever you'd like." He sat with that. Outside, the late August wind moved through the scrub. The lamp between them flickered once. "I should have dealt with this earlier," he said. It came out at a lower register than his usual voice, something in it that was closer to what lay underneath all the careful flatness. "Probably," Elena said. She didn't soften it because she'd learned he didn't want things softened, but she said it without judgment, because it wasn't her place to judge a man for spending 14 months trying to survive the unsurvivable. He nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something. Then, "Henderson's place is north of here, about 4 miles. He's usually back from the south pasture by 3 in the afternoon. I'll drive you tomorrow if you'd like company," she said, "or I can manage supper without you if you'd rather go alone." A pause. Something almost like surprise. "You don't need to come." "I know." She stood and collected the coffee cups. "Offer's there." He went alone in the end, which was what she'd expected. He came back before supper with a deal struck. Grazing rights on the north parcel through December, enough to make the math work for the next few months. He told her about it at supper without quite looking at her, in the tone of someone reporting facts, and she nodded and said that was good, and put more stew in Lily's bowl and didn't make it into more than it was. But that night, when the house was quiet, she let herself feel something. Not triumph. It wasn't hers to feel triumphant about. More like the specific satisfaction of watching a stuck thing begin to move. September arrived, and with it the first hint that the drought might not be permanent after all. Not rain, not yet, but a change in the air, a quality to the morning sky that told people who knew the land that something was shifting somewhere out beyond the horizon. The children had gone back to school in town, which meant the household rhythm changed. Elena drove them in the wagon each morning, a 40-minute round trip each way, and picked them up each afternoon, which gave her a particular kind of time alone in the middle of the day that she used for the heavier work. The floor scrubbing, the pantry organizing, the slow repair of all the things in the house that had been meaning to be repaired for longer than anyone wanted to count. It was on one of these morning drives that Lily, sitting beside her on the wagon bench, said out of nowhere, "Thomas talked to you about Mama." Elena kept her eyes on the road. "He mentioned her once, yes." "He doesn't do that," Lily said. "Talk about her." She said it with the same matter-of-fact delivery she brought to most observations, but underneath it was something that had been sitting on her for a while. "Papa doesn't either. It's like—" She thought about how to say it. "It's like, if nobody says her name enough, she'll disappear even more." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Is that how it feels to you?" "Sometimes," Lily said. "I try to remember what her voice sounded like, and sometimes I can't." She said it plainly, like a fact about the world, but her hands in her lap tightened around each other. "Does that happen?" "Yes," Elena said. "That happens. It doesn't mean you're forgetting her." "Papa was crying last night." Lily said it suddenly, like she'd been holding it and had run out of room. "I got up to get water and I heard him. In the room." She paused. "He doesn't know I heard." Elena kept driving. "He must miss her very much," she said. "I know," Lily said. "I just—" The sentence didn't finish, and she didn't push it to finish. She let it sit, and Lily sat with it, and the horse pulled the wagon east toward town in the cool September morning, and the sky ahead was the particular pale blue of a day that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. "Miss Mercer," Lily said eventually, "are you going to stay?" The question arrived with the weight of something that had been building for weeks. Elena felt it land. She thought about how to answer it honestly, because Lily was the kind of child who deserved an honest answer and would know if she wasn't getting one. "I plan to," she said. "That's my intention." Lily was quiet for a moment, processing. "That's not the same as yes." "No," Elena agreed. "It's not." Lily nodded slowly, with the gravity of a child who has learned the difference between what people mean and what they say, and knows when both are being offered at once. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive, but when she climbed down from the wagon at the school steps, she turned back for a moment. "I hope you do," she said. "Stay." And she went inside. Elena sat on the wagon bench for a moment longer than she needed to before she turned the horse around. "I hope you do." She drove back to the ranch through the early morning with those words sitting somewhere in her chest, in a place she hadn't known she'd left unguarded. It was a Tuesday in late September when the roof of the barn started leaking, a slow drip that Gideon discovered on an otherwise ordinary morning, tracing a water trail across the barn floor to find a section of roofing that had warped and separated, leaving a gap just wide enough to be a problem when the rains came. If the rains came. He spent 2 days on it. Elena could hear him up there, boots on the roof, the occasional sound of something not going right, followed by a silence that had a specific quality to it. On the afternoon of the second day, she brought a jar of water out to the base of the ladder and stood there until he climbed down, which he did with the expression of a man who has been fighting with a roof and has won, but only barely. He took the water without comment, drank half of it, looked back up at the roof. "Is it done?" she asked. "It'll hold," he said, which she'd learned was Gideon's version of yes, but I reserve the right to be pessimistic about it. He was covered in dust and wood shavings and something that had stained the sleeve of his shirt, and he looked exhausted in the particular way of a man who was always exhausted, but today it was also visible on his face. He sat down on the bottom rung of the ladder and didn't immediately stand back up, which was unusual. Gideon was not a man who sat. She sat on the overturned water barrel nearby. Not close enough to impose, just there. They sat in the quiet for a while. The afternoon had cooled slightly, and the light was getting its long afternoon quality, the shadows stretching out from the corral fence. "I keep making lists," Gideon said eventually, not looking at her, "of things that need doing. It keeps getting longer." He paused. Clara was good at that, keeping track. She'd remember in April that the barn roof would need checking in September, and she'd tell me in time to get to it before it became a problem. Another pause, longer. "I'm not good at that kind of thinking, forward thinking. I do the thing in front of me, and then the next thing. He stopped. Put the water jar down in the dirt. Elena waited. "I'm sorry," he said. "You didn't ask." "I don't mind," she said. He looked at her then for a moment. "You're patient," he said, which he'd said before, in almost the same words weeks ago. But it sounded different now, less like an observation and more like something he was still figuring out what to do with. "I'm not always," she said. "Ask the fence post. I lost my patience with it on the third try." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest she'd seen to something that was working toward a smile, and it lasted only a second before his face returned to its usual arrangement, but it had been there. She filed it away in the section she kept for things that mattered. He stood, picked up the toolbox. "Supper in an hour?" "An hour," she confirmed. He nodded and went back toward the barn to put the tools away, and she watched him go with the late afternoon light behind him, and she thought, this house is not done being difficult. It had weeks and probably months of difficult left in it. The roof would hold, the finances would hold for now. But Gideon Hale was still a man who hadn't found his way to the center of his own grief. Thomas was still a boy who'd put a door between himself and everyone. Lily was still a 7-year-old carrying more than she should. But he'd said Clara's name. Twice, in a row, talking about her like a person rather than a ghost he couldn't look at. That was something. She went inside to start supper. October arrived the way difficult things often do, gradually and then all at once. The first frost came 3 days earlier than anyone in Briar Ridge had predicted, hitting on a Tuesday night when the temperature dropped 20 degrees between sunset and midnight. Elena woke at 2 in the morning with the cold on her face through the window she'd left cracked open and the immediate practical thought that the vegetable garden was going to take damage. She got up, put on her coat over her nightgown, went out to the garden with a lamp in the dark, which was how Gideon found her 20 minutes later when he came out to check the horses. He stood at the garden gate in his coat and boots with his hair still flattened from sleep and looked at her crouching in the lamplight, pulling the last of the squash from the frost-bitten vines with her bare hands because she hadn't stopped to find gloves. "How bad?" he said. "The squash is done. I can save most of the root vegetables if I get them in now." She looked up at him. "I could use another pair of hands." He came through the gate without another word and crouched down on the other side of the bed and started pulling carrots from the frozen ground. They worked in silence for 40 minutes, passing the lamp back and forth when they needed it, filling the bucket Elena had grabbed from the back porch. The cold had its teeth in everything. Her hands were numb by the end, and she suspected his were too, though he didn't say so. They brought the vegetables in and spread them on the kitchen counter, and Gideon made coffee because it was almost 4 in the morning by then, and neither of them was going back to sleep. They stood at the counter and looked at the pile of carrots and turnips and the few potatoes that hadn't frozen solid yet. "It's more than I thought we'd save," Elena said. "Yeah." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His knuckles were red from the cold and the dirt. "The squash would have lasted us another month." "I know." She looked at the pile. "But the rest will get us through." He nodded. She could feel him standing beside her. That particular awareness you develop of another person's proximity when you've been living in close quarters with them for months, when you've learned the rhythms of how they move through a space. "Thank you," he said, "for getting up." "It's my garden too," she said, and then she heard how that sounded and added, "I've been tending it." He didn't say anything, but she felt a small shift in the air between them, subtle enough that she might have imagined it, except she'd gotten reasonably good at reading the atmosphere around Gideon Hale. She went back to bed and lay in the dark with her cold hands pressed between her knees, and the smell of frozen earth still on her, and she thought about what she'd said. "It's my garden too." She hadn't planned that. It had come out of somewhere she hadn't examined. She examined it now, lying in the dark. She'd been here 3 months. The garden was hers in the way things become yours when you've put your hands into them long enough. The kitchen was hers in the same way. The mending pile that was finally actually empty. The children's morning routines, the weekly supply runs, the particular system she'd developed for managing the ranch's household accounts that Gideon had stopped questioning and started simply relying on. She'd stopped counting the days sometime in August. That was, she suspected, worth noting. The frost broke something loose in the pace of October. There was a new urgency to everything, winterizing the barn, checking the firewood supply, making sure the storm windows were fitted properly on the house, none of which had been fully dealt with because October had seemed far away in September and then wasn't anymore. Gideon drove himself through these tasks with the focused intensity of a man who understands deadline work, and Elena worked alongside him in the ways she could and managed the household with extra attention in the ways she couldn't. Thomas, for his part, had become something unexpected. It hadn't happened all at once. There was no single moment she could point to. It had accumulated in small increments. The fence post repair, the rinsed dishes, the salt passed before Lily asked, the information volunteered about the well pump, the afternoon she'd overheard him in the barn talking to the horses in a low, private voice, and had very deliberately made enough noise on her approach that he'd heard her coming and stopped and gone back to being 12 and armored. But something in him had loosened, not melted, loosened. There was still the jaw set and the deliberately occupied silences and the studied indifference. But there were also the other things now, the things that lived alongside the armor. The way he'd started sitting at the kitchen table and doing his schoolwork in the afternoons sometimes, rather than always going upstairs. The way he'd started, occasionally, addressing Elena by name instead of not addressing her by name, which had been his original strategy for maintaining a position of technically not acknowledging her existence. The Tuesday of the second week of October, he came home from school with a torn collar on his shirt, a bruise developing under his right eye, and a composure so intensely controlled that it was its own kind of statement. Elena was at the stove when he came in. She heard the back door and his boots on the kitchen floor, and turned. She looked at his face. He looked back at her with an expression that was preemptively daring her to say something. She said, "Are you hurt anywhere besides your face?" He blinked. That was clearly not the question he'd been expecting. "No," he said after a moment. "Sit down." I'll get water and cloth. I'm fine. Thomas, sit down. He sat. She got the basin and cloth and sat across from him and cleaned the cut at the corner of his eye, which wasn't deep but had bled, which cost him something. Who started it? She asked, working. A pause. Does it matter? Probably not for what I need to do right now. I'm just asking. He watched her work on his face with the expression of someone making a series of small decisions. Garrett Finch said something, he said finally. About what? Longer pause. About Papa. About the ranch. That we're... He said the next word like it tasted bad. Charity cases. That we can't pay our bills and everybody in town knows it. Elena kept her hand steady. And you hit him, she said. I hit him second, Thomas said, with the specific precision of someone who'd been keeping track. Is Garrett Finch bigger than you? Something almost unwilling crossed his face. A little. So you hit someone bigger than you who said something true that you didn't want to hear, she said. Calm. Not unkind, but not soft about it either. Thomas's jaw tightened. It wasn't his business to say. No, Elena agreed. It wasn't, but it doesn't become less true because you hit the person who said it. She set the cloth down. And hitting him didn't change the situation. It just added a bruise. He stared at her. You sound like you're taking his side. I'm not. What he said was unkind, and I'd tell him so to his face. She looked at him steadily. What I'm telling you is that you can't hit your way out of hard things, Thomas. You can only hit your way into harder ones. He was quiet. His hands on the table were the hands of a boy who was too old for his age, knuckles scraped, nails bitten down. Papa doesn't know we're behind on the bills, he said. It came out quietly, like something he'd been carrying. Your father's dealing with it, she said. Is it bad? She chose her answer carefully. It was worse than it needed to be. It's getting better. He looked at her. Because of you, he said. Not grateful, exactly. More like arriving at an honest accounting of a thing. Because your father made some decisions, she said. I helped him see the options. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving around the corners of the house in that October way that promised November. He doesn't ask for help, Thomas said. He never does. I know. Mama used to... He stopped. His hands moved on the table, a small, reflexive motion. She used to say he'd rather break in half than bend. Elena looked at him. He was looking at his hands. She sounds like she knew him well, she said. Yeah. He said it quietly. Then he pulled his hands off the table and pushed his chair back. I'm going to go change my shirt. The torn collar, I know, I'll leave it for the mending. He was already at the kitchen door, then, without turning around, Don't tell Papa about the fight. That's between you and him, she said. But Thomas, he's going to see your face. A pause. I know, he said again, and went. Gideon came in from the north pasture an hour later and saw his son's face, and Elena watched the whole of it from the kitchen. The way Gideon stopped in the doorway, the way Thomas straightened and prepared for it, the way Gideon crossed to him and put a hand on his son's jaw and turned his face to look at the bruise with the particular attention of a father who keeps everything locked up except in moments like this. What happened? Gideon said. Quiet. Fight at school, Thomas said. Who? Garrett Finch. A pause. He's 50, Gideon said. I know. Another pause. Gideon's hand dropped from his son's face. He looked at Thomas for a long moment with something complicated moving through him. Worry and something that might have been the reluctant beginning of pride, and then the checking of that instinct. Does he look worse than you? Gideon asked. Thomas almost smiled. About the same, he said. Gideon made a sound that was carefully not a laugh. Go wash up for supper, he said. And that was it. Thomas went upstairs and Gideon came into the kitchen and didn't look at Elena directly and said nothing about the fight, and she said nothing about the fight, and supper was ready in 20 minutes. At the table, partway through the meal, Gideon said to Thomas, Finch boys have always had big mouths, runs in the family. He set it into his plate, not looking up. Thomas looked at his father. Something shifted in his face. Some tightly held thing giving just slightly at one edge. Yeah, Thomas said, and went back to his food. Elena moved her fork and said nothing and did not look at either of them. The first week of November brought rain. Not the slow, uncertain kind that had been teasing the mesa for weeks, but real rain. 2 days of steady, soaking, honest-to-the-ground rain that ran off the mesa and down through the dry creek bed and turned it from cracked brown mud to something that moved again. The fields didn't recover overnight. That wasn't how it worked. But the smell of the air changed, and people in Briar Ridge walked out onto their porches and looked at the sky with expressions that were too fragile to be called hope, but were in the neighborhood. Elena stood at the kitchen window on the second morning of rain and watched it fall on the garden, on the repaired fence posts, on the barn roof that was holding, and felt something ease in her that she hadn't known was tightly wound. Lily came down in the early morning and stood beside her at the window. "It's raining," Lily said with satisfaction. "It is. The creek will come back." "Probably," Elena said. "It takes time." Lily leaned her head against Elena's arm, just for a moment, the brief and weightless press of a child's head, unconscious, like something that had happened before the girl had thought to do it. Then she seemed to notice and straightened up slightly, cautious, watching Elena's face. Elena didn't move. She kept looking out the window. Lily stayed where she was. After a moment, she leaned against Elena's arm again, more deliberately this time, and this time didn't pull away. They stood at the window and watched the rain. The breaking point, when it came, was not dramatic in the way breaking points are sometimes imagined. There was no single shouted argument, no slammed door. It came on a Thursday evening in the second week of November, quiet and incremental, and then suddenly very loud in the interior of one man who had been holding too much alone for too long. Elena had made soup, a real one, with the stored vegetables from the frost rescue, and some of the salt pork, the kind of soup that actually required tending and had been on the stove since early afternoon. The house smelled like itself in a way it hadn't in a long time. The specific warmth of food cooking layered with the wood smoke from the fireplace that Elena had been keeping lit since October. Gideon came in late, later than usual. It was past 6 and nearly dark when she heard his boots on the porch steps. She heard him stop outside the door, which was unusual. Gideon was not a man who paused on his own porch. She heard something that took her a moment to identify, the sound of him leaning against the door frame, the creak of it, just standing there. She waited. He came in eventually. He looked wrong, not hurt physically. She checked for that first out of habit. But the particular kind of wrong that happens when something in a person's internal structure has given way and they don't know yet what to do about it. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "Gideon." She didn't say anything else, just his name, and she said it in the tone of someone who is not going to have an argument about whether he needs to sit down. He sat at the kitchen table. She brought him coffee, and he wrapped his hands around it and stared at the surface of the liquid. "What happened?" she asked. A long silence. Outside, the wind had come back after the rain, the November kind that had cold in its bones. "I went by Albert's grave today," he said. His father. "Haven't been since the burial." He stopped, started again. "I don't know why I went today. I was near the cemetery on the way back from the north pasture, and I went in." He was quiet. "Clara's grave is there, next to where my father is now." Elena sat down across from him. She didn't say anything. "I stood there for—" He shook his head. "I don't even know how long. I couldn't—" He stopped and his jaw worked. "I couldn't remember if I'd told her I was sorry, before she died. She was sick for 3 weeks and I was in and out and I kept thinking there'd be more time and then there wasn't, and I can't—" His voice didn't break exactly, but it changed register, went lower and rougher. "I can't remember if I said it." Elena was very still. "Sorry for what?" she asked. "Quiet. For not being—" He stopped again. His hands tightened on the cup. "For working too much. For not seeing how tired she was before she got sick. For not getting the doctor sooner. For—" He made a sound that was not quite a word. "I keep the list. Every day I add to it. Things I should have done differently. Things I should have said." "Gideon. The children." His voice cracked on the word the first time she'd heard it do that. "They needed her, and she's gone, and I am. I am not what they need. I know that. I'm not good at—" I can't give them what she gave them. I don't know how. He looked up at her then, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has been alone with something too big for too long. I don't know how to do any of this. The kitchen was quiet around them. The soup moved on the stove in small, patient bubbles. Elena looked at him, at the man who'd moved out of his own doorway on the first evening to let her in, not graciously, not willingly, but enough. Who'd sat at the table and eaten what she put in front of him. Who'd gone to Henderson's alone because he wasn't ready to accept company for hard things, but had gone. Who'd put his hand on his son's jaw to look at a bruise, and hadn't said, "I'm proud of you," but had said, "Finch boys have always had big mouths," which was, in its own dialect, the same thing. "You've been keeping them alive," she said. "For 14 months by yourself, you've been keeping 2 children alive, and a ranch running, and a house standing." She said it plainly, without inflation. "That's not nothing. That's actually very hard, and you've been doing it." He shook his head. That's not just anything," she said. "Don't reduce it." He looked at her. "The list you keep," she said. "The things you should have done differently. I'm not going to tell you the list is wrong. Maybe some of those things are true. But Clara was sick and she died, and none of the things on that list would have changed that. And I think somewhere you know it and somewhere you don't. And until the part of you that doesn't starts believing the part of you that does." She stopped herself, chose the next words carefully. "You're carrying something that was never meant to be carried alone. And it's getting heavier, not lighter, and I can see it." The kitchen was quiet for a long time. "I told her I loved her," he said finally, low. "That morning, before she went." A pause. "I didn't say sorry. I said I loved her. He stopped. "I can't remember if that was enough." "It was enough," Elena said. He looked at her. "You don't know, sis." "No," she said. "I don't. But I know it was what you had, and you gave it, and that's all anyone can do." Something in his face, some structure that had been held very tight for a very long time, shifted. Not collapsed, not broke. Just shifted, the way old wood shifts under heat, releasing something it's been holding. He put his face in his hands. His shoulders moved. He didn't make a sound. She sat across from him and didn't move and didn't say anything and didn't look away, because she'd learned that this was what was needed. Not comfort exactly, not words, just the simple fact of another person staying in the room. Not leaving, not being frightened by it, just staying. He was not a man who let himself be seen doing this. She understood that. She understood what it was costing him, and she held it carefully. After a while, the movement in his shoulders stopped. He stayed with his face in his hands for another moment. Then he lifted his head. His eyes were red, and he made no particular effort to hide it. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was—" "Don't apologize," she said. He looked at her. Something had changed in his face. Something had been put down that he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten he was carrying it, and the absence of it made him look younger somehow. Not lighter exactly, just different, altered. "The children," he started. "Are upstairs and didn't hear anything," she said. He nodded, looked at his coffee cup. "Thomas asked me last week," he said, "if things were getting better on the ranch." "What did you tell him?" "I told him things were getting better." He paused. "And they are, because of—" He stopped and then did something she didn't expect. He looked at her directly and said it straight. "Because of you." She held that. "We found a way to work," she said. "Elena." He said her name, her first name, for the first time, without either of them apparently planning it. She felt it the way you feel the first warm day after a very long winter. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just suddenly real after a long time of not being real. "I don't know what I would have—" He stopped, shook his head. She could hear the children upstairs. Lily's light footsteps crossing her floor, Thomas's heavier tread. The ordinary music of a household doing its evening things. "Supper's ready," she said. Because it was, and because it was true, and because some moments need to be allowed to settle before anything else is built on top of them. He looked at her for another moment, then he nodded. "I'll call the children." He stood, straightened. He was still the same man, still careful, still guarded, still carrying the weight of things. But he'd put one piece of it down. She'd watched him do it, and he'd done it in front of her, which meant something. He went to the bottom of the stairs and called up to Thomas and Lily, and Elena ladled the soup into bowls, and the kitchen filled with the sound of children on stairs and the warmth of the stove and the smell of food that someone had spent the afternoon making. At the table, partway through supper, Lily looked at her father and then at Elena and then at her soup. "Is Elena staying?" she asked. She hadn't planned it. Elena could tell. It had simply come out. The way things come out of children when they've been thinking them long enough that the pressure becomes too much. The table went quiet. Gideon looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Elena. A direct look, the kind that didn't have any careful distance in it. Elena looked back at him. She felt the weight of the question settle over the table like weather. The question that had been building since July. Since the first evening she'd stood in this doorway with a canvas bag and a letter and a town full of people who'd already decided she wouldn't last. Since the morning Lily had leaned her head against Elena's arm at the kitchen window. Since the afternoon Thomas had said my mother used to do that and walked out of the garden before she could respond. Since the night Gideon had stood in this kitchen with his face in his hands and let her stay in the room. The soup was getting cold. Nobody moved. The question hung over the table like smoke. Lily was looking at her soup now, as if she'd surprised herself with what had come out of her mouth, and was waiting to see what the air did with it. Thomas had gone very still, in the particular way he went still, when something was happening that he cared about more than he wanted to show. Gideon was looking at Elena with an expression that had nothing careful in it anymore, which was new enough to be almost disorienting. Elena set her spoon down. "Yes," she said. She said it to Lily first because Lily had asked. Then she looked at Gideon, and she said it again, quieter. "Yes." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Lily picked up her spoon and went back to her soup with the small, contained satisfaction of someone who has gotten an answer they needed and is choosing to receive it quietly rather than make a scene of it. Thomas looked at his bowl. His jaw moved. He reached for the bread without being asked and tore a piece and ate it, and the act of eating seemed like his version of agreement, or at least of not objecting. Gideon held her gaze for another moment. Then he looked down at his soup and picked up his own spoon, and the table went back to the ordinary sounds of a family at supper. But it was different. The air was different. Something that had been held at arm's length for months had been let closer, and everyone at the table felt it, and nobody was entirely sure what to do with it, and so they ate their soup and passed the bread and let the evening be what it was. Later, after the children were in bed, Gideon found Elena in the kitchen washing the supper bowls. He came in and leaned against the counter a few feet from her, not quite beside her, not across from her, and they stayed that way for a moment with the lamp between them. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "No." "You meant it." "I said it, didn't I?" She kept washing, not looking at him. "I don't say things I don't mean." He was quiet. She could feel him working up to something, the way she'd learned to recognize, the slight change in how he held himself when he was deciding whether to go forward with a thought or pull back from it. "I haven't been easy," he said. She almost smiled, kept her face neutral. "No. I know the first weeks were, Gideon." She set the bowl on the counter and turned to look at him. "I'm not keeping score." "I know you're not," he said. "I am." He said it with the blunt directness that she'd come to recognize as his version of honesty. Not eloquent, not carefully arranged, just the thing itself, unadorned. "I didn't make it easy for you to stay, and you stayed anyway." "I told you on the first night," she said, "I don't need you to make it easy. I just needed you to let me in the door." He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were on the counter, slightly behind him, the posture of a man who is keeping himself from reaching for something he's not sure he has permission to reach for. "I'd like things to be different," he said, "between us, going forward." He stopped, tried again. "I'm not—" Another stop, and she could see him being frustrated with himself, with the distance between what he meant and what he was managing to say. "I'm not asking you to be Clara. I wouldn't do that." "I know," she said. "I'm asking if there's—" He seemed to run out of words entirely, and stood there in the gap of the unfinished sentence. "There is," she said. Quiet, direct, the way she was direct about everything. He exhaled slowly. Not a sigh, more like something released. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a scene out of anyone's idea of a romance. It was two people in a kitchen at 10 o'clock at night with dishwater on the counter and November wind at the window, saying a careful, real thing to each other and meaning it. It was enough. It was in fact the right size for what it was. She turned back to the dishes. He picked up the cloth and dried the bowl she'd set on the counter, and they finished the washing up together without talking, which was its own kind of thing. The weeks that followed were not suddenly easier. That was the part that nobody outside the house would have understood if they'd been told. That the decision changes something, but it doesn't dissolve the difficulty. It just changes the nature of it. Before, the difficulty had been about whether any of them trusted each other enough to let the walls down. Now the difficulty was everything underneath the walls. Gideon was not a man who unraveled quickly or completely. He had years of practice containment, and it didn't simply stop because he'd made a decision. There were mornings when he came down to breakfast with his face closed and his words minimal and the old distance back around him. And Elena learned to read the difference between the distance that was directed at her and the distance that was just him processing something internal. And she learned not to take the second kind personally. Some days he talked. Some days he didn't. She had not signed on for a man who was suddenly easy, and she didn't expect him to become one. But there were other things, smaller things, that accrued. He started waiting for her after supper instead of disappearing to the barn or the back room. Not always, not every night, but often enough that she started to expect it. He'd sit at the kitchen table with his coffee while she cleaned up, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and both versions were fine. He started telling her things about the ranch in the way that he'd tell a partner rather than an employee, not asking permission, but including her in his thinking, talking through problems out loud, and sometimes not even needing a response, just needing the presence of someone who understood the situation well enough to hear it. In late November, she came back from the morning school run to find he'd repaired the shutter that had been hanging at an angle since July. It was just nailed back straight and secure, no ceremony. He was already back in the barn by the time she noticed it. But she stood in the yard and looked at the straight shutter and the repaired fence and the vegetable garden put to bed for the winter with proper cover, and she thought, this house is starting to remember what it was built for. Thomas was the one she worried about most going into December. The loosening she'd seen in October had continued, in its slow and unsentimental way. He was present now, in a way he hadn't been in July. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the simple fact of his being in the same rooms as other people and not working so hard to be unavailable. He did his homework at the kitchen table most afternoons. He'd started talking at supper, not just answering questions, but occasionally initiating, which was its own kind of milestone. He'd helped Gideon with the barn weatherproofing in early November and come in afterward with mud on his boots and his father's same particular expression of tired satisfaction. And Elena had seen Gideon look at his son and briefly look like he might say something before he looked away. They were so alike, those two, and so bad at the specific things they were alike about. She raised it with Gideon one evening in early December, the two of them at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. She'd been working up to it for a while. "You and Thomas need to talk," she said. He looked up from the ledger he'd been looking at. "We talk. About the ranch. About chores." She held his gaze. "You don't talk about Clara." A pause. "He doesn't want to." "He does," she said. "He just doesn't know how to start it, and he's waiting for you to start it, and you're both going to keep waiting." Gideon was quiet. His hand was flat on the ledger, not moving. "She's his mother," Elena said. "He's 12 and he doesn't have anyone to remember her with. Lily talks to me sometimes. Thomas doesn't talk to anyone. He talks to the horses in the barn when he thinks nobody can hear him, and I think he might be talking to her." Something moved across Gideon's face that he didn't manage to contain before she saw it. "I don't know how to do that," he said. "Talk about her. I can't." He stopped. "When I start, I can't always." "I know," she said. "But he needs it more than you need to not do it." He sat with that for a long moment. The wind was doing its December thing outside, working around the house looking for a way in, and the fire in the main room was doing its job keeping it out. "I'll try," he said. Not cheerfully, not with confidence, but straight and real, which was the only way Gideon said things that mattered. She nodded and left it there. She didn't know exactly what passed between Gideon and Thomas 2 days later. She'd come in from feeding the chickens to find the kitchen empty and voices from the front room, low, Gideon's register, and then Thomas's, shorter responses. She didn't slow down to listen. She hung up her coat and put water on for coffee and went about the kitchen quietly and let whatever was happening in the front room be private. It lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then Thomas came through the kitchen without looking at her and went straight upstairs, and she heard his door close. Not slammed, just closed. Gideon came in and stood at the kitchen window. She put a cup of coffee on the counter near him and didn't ask anything. After a while, he said, "He's been keeping a list, too." She waited. Things he wishes he'd said to her, he wrote them down. His voice was careful in the way voices get when they're transporting something fragile. "He didn't show me the list. He just told me it existed." He paused. He asked me if I thought she knew that he loved her. He wanted to know if 12-year-olds are supposed to say that to their mothers, or if it's just assumed. Elena's chest tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him she knew." He picked up the coffee cup, stared into it. "I told him that every time she watched him at supper, or fixed his collar before school, or saved the last biscuit for him because she knew he'd want it, that was her knowing. And his being there was him saying it back, that it didn't need to be in words." "That was the right thing to say," Elena said. Careful, quiet. "I don't know if it helped." It did. He was quiet for another moment. "He cried," he said. "A little. He tried very hard not to, and then he did anyway, and then he got angry at himself for it." "That's what was supposed to happen," she said. "He's been not crying for over a year. Something needed to move." Gideon nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the December sky, gray and low and pressing down on the mesa. "When does it stop feeling like this?" he asked. Not dramatic, just a real question, asked plainly. "I don't know," she said. "I think it changes. I don't think it stops." He nodded again, as if this was the answer he'd expected and had needed to hear confirmed anyway. Upstairs, she could hear Thomas moving around his room. Eventually, the sound settled into the creak of his bed, lying down. The particular sound of a person who has put something down and is resting under the absence of its weight. December moved through the house in the way that month does, heavy and short-dayed and particular in its demands. There were good days and bad ones, and Elena had stopped expecting the ratio to be anything other than what it was. The ranch was stable, not thriving, but stable. The Henderson lease making the difference it needed to make. The household accounts running on the system she'd established. The pantry full enough to get through to spring without serious worry. She had a conversation with Gideon about the spring that she'd been building toward for a while. The South Field, she said. They were at the kitchen table in the evening, the ledger between them, the kind of conversation that had become normal, practical and direct and conducted between two people who had gotten past the need to handle each other carefully. If the rain holds through spring, you could plant it differently. Less hay, more cash crop. There's a market in Santa Fe for dried corn if the yields are decent. He studied the numbers she'd laid out. That's a risk if the drought comes back. It's a risk either way. Right now you're dependent on one income stream and it's weather dependent regardless. She pointed at the column on the right. This is what the corn could bring if the yields come in at even 60% of the estimate. He looked at it. His thumb tapped the table. His thinking habit, she'd noted. "Who told you about the Santa Fe market?" "Harlan, at the feed store. He's been supplying a trader there for 2 years. I talked to him on the last supply run." He looked up at her. "You went and got that information." "I thought it might be useful." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly. More like a man repeatedly encountering a version of things that is better than what he'd planned and having to keep updating his plan accordingly. "You're running this ranch," he said. "Half of it," she said. "More than half," he said. And there was something in how he said it. Not complaint, not the earlier discomfort she'd heard when he'd said something similar months ago. Something closer to the plain acknowledgement of fact between equals. She looked back at the ledger. "The South Field," she said. "The South Field," he agreed. Christmas came and nobody made a large production of it, which was the right call. Elena made a proper meal. A roasted chicken, the last of the preserved vegetables done up right. A dried apple cake because Lily had mentioned in early December that Clara used to make an apple cake at Christmas. A piece of information Elena had stored without comment and acted on quietly. She didn't announce it as Clara's recipe. She just made it. Lily sat down at the table and went very still for a moment when she saw it, and then she sat up straight and looked at her plate. "That's Mama's cake," she said, to no one in particular. Not upset, just naming it, the way Lily named things. Thomas looked at it, looked at Elena. Something moved in his face that he didn't try to hide, which was new. Gideon looked at Elena across the table, over the heads of his children, and the look was long and quiet and held more than she knew what to do with, and so she looked at the cake and picked up the knife. "I'll cut it," she said. "It was not a perfect Christmas." Gideon burned his hand slightly on the stove in the morning, which put him in a mood for a couple of hours before it passed. Thomas and Lily argued after dinner about something small and trivial in the specific way of siblings who are comfortable enough to argue, which was actually a good sign even though it didn't sound like one. The fire smoked badly when the wind changed direction in the evening, and they had to open the windows for 20 minutes in the December cold until it cleared. But Lily wore her best dress and sat at the table with her back straight and ate 2 pieces of cake. Thomas helped clear the dishes without being asked and then came back to sit by the fire rather than going upstairs, which he wouldn't have done in July. Gideon sat across the fire from Elena in the evening, and they talked quietly while the children were occupied. And at some point she realized the conversation had been going for an hour and a half, and she'd stopped tracking the time, which hadn't happened to her in a very long while. "Tell me something," Gideon said. The fire had burned down and the room was warm and the wind outside was not a threatening kind, just the regular December kind. "About what?" "You. Something I don't know." She thought about this. "I didn't want to do this work at first," she said, "when I was younger. I did it because I needed the income. I thought I'd do it for a couple of years and then, I didn't know what then, something else." She looked at the fire. "Somewhere around the 3rd family I worked for, I started to understand that this was actually the work. Not the cooking or the cleaning, the part where a house is falling apart and someone has to be willing to stay in it long enough to figure out which pieces can be saved." She paused. "I'm not always right about which pieces those are, but I always stay long enough to find out." He was quiet for a moment. "Were there places you couldn't save?" "2, she said. "One was too far gone before I got there. One, the man didn't want to be saved, and you can't want it for someone." Gideon absorbed this. "Is that what you thought when you got here? That we were too far gone?" "No," she said. "I thought you were stubborn and proud and in a lot of pain and the children were hungry." She looked at him. "I thought if someone could just get the stove lit, there was something worth saving." He held her gaze. "You got the stove lit," he said. "You let me," she said. He reached across the space between them and put his hand over hers, on the arm of the chair. It was deliberate and unambiguous and very careful, the way Gideon did things that mattered to him. Not impulsive, not dramatic, just real and solid and there. She turned her hand over and let his close around it. They sat by the fire while the house settled around them, the children quiet upstairs, the wind outside doing its ordinary work, the lamp on the table burning low. The first week of January, Thomas did something she hadn't expected. He came to her in the kitchen on a Saturday morning when Gideon had gone to town, and Lily was next door in the garden, looking at what the winter had done to it, and planning, Elena suspected, what she wanted to plant in spring. He came in and sat at the kitchen table with a folded piece of paper in his hands. He put it on the table and looked at it, and then looked at her. "I want to show you something," he said. "You don't have to. You can just read it and not say anything. That would be fine." She dried her hands and came to the table and sat down across from him. He unfolded the paper. It was not a single piece. It was several, folded together, covered in his handwriting in both pencil and ink, some of it clearly written at different times, the earlier parts more childish, the later ones more controlled. At the top of the first page, in careful letters, "Things I wish I'd said to Mama." She read it slowly. She didn't rush through it. It was private, and it was his, and he had chosen to give her access to it, which meant she owed it the respect of her full attention. There were small things on the list. "I wish I'd told her the breakfast she made on my birthday was the best thing I ever ate." There were harder things. "I wish I'd told her I wasn't scared of her being sick. I was, but I wish I'd told her I wasn't, so she wouldn't worry." There were things that were simply grief, unadorned and honest. "I wish I'd told her that when she used to fix my collar before school, I knew it was just a collar, but it felt like something else, and I don't know the word for what it felt like." She got to the end. She folded it carefully, the same way he'd folded it, and put it back on the table in front of him. She didn't say anything for a moment. He was watching her face. "It's good," she said. "What you wrote. It's real." He looked at the paper. "Papa and I talked about her," he said, "a few weeks ago." "I know." "Did he tell you?" "A little." He nodded. His hands were around the paper now, not unfolding it, just holding it. "I still don't know why you stayed," he said. "Here. When it was... we weren't..." He seemed frustrated with himself, with the limits of what he was able to say. "Thomas," she said, "I stayed because you were worth staying for. All of you." She paused. "And because I was tired of leaving places before they were finished." He looked at her. 12 years old, with his father's eyes and his mother's way of paying attention to things. Something in his face settled. Not resolution exactly, not peace, but something in that direction, the distant precursor to those things. He picked up the paper and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he stood. "I'm going to check on Lily," he said. "She's probably trying to plant something, and it's January." "Tell her the ground's still frozen," Elena said. "She knows that," he said. "She'll do it anyway." He was already at the back door. He paused there, not turning around. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Yes." "A moment. I'm glad you stayed." He opened the door and went out into the January morning. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after he was gone. Through the window she could see the garden. Lily crouching near the edge of it with a stick, doing something in the dirt, and Thomas appearing through the gate and coming up beside her and saying something that made Lily look up and then look back at whatever she was doing, defending it. Thomas crouched down too and looked at it and said something else. Lily appeared to explain. Thomas appeared to reconsider his position. The winter light came through the window at a low angle and put long shadows across the yard. The horses were visible at the edge of the corral. The barn roof was holding. The south field lay dormant under the January cold, waiting for what spring would bring. Gideon came back from town in the early afternoon, the wagon crunching on the frozen ground, and Elena had coffee on the stove, and the children came in from outside with cold faces and the particular energy of kids who've been given a free morning, and the kitchen filled with the noise of it. The children talking over each other, the sound of coats being hung up, the dog that had appeared at the ranch in November and had not left since scratching at the back door to be let in. Gideon came into the kitchen and looked at all of this, the noise and the warmth and the ordinary chaos, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with his hat in his hands. He looked at Elena. She was at the stove with her back to the room, and she could feel him looking, and she turned to look back. His face was open in a way she hadn't seen from him in all the months she'd known him. Not unguarded, Gideon would never be unguarded, but open enough that she could see what was in it. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "Coffee's ready," she said. He came into the kitchen. February was the month the dog got a name. He'd been around since November, appeared one morning at the back door with a cut on his left ear, and the general demeanor of an animal that has been surviving on its own long enough to have developed opinions about it. Elena had fed him scraps and cleaned the ear and not made any declarations about whether he was staying, because declarations invite arguments, and the dog seemed content to simply install himself without requiring anyone's permission. Thomas called him Soot on account of the color, and after that he had a name and nobody disputed it. Small things like that were how February announced that something had shifted. Not the dog specifically, but the accumulation of ordinary decisions being made. Thomas naming the dog, Lily planting seeds in small pots on the kitchen windowsill because the ground was still too hard, but she had plans for spring and wasn't willing to wait entirely. Gideon asking Elena at breakfast one morning what she thought about getting 2 more chickens to replace the ones lost to the frost, as if her opinion on the chicken count was simply a thing that was consulted now, which it was. That was just how things worked. The ranch was not fixed. She wanted to be clear about that, even inside her own thinking. The Henderson lease ran through March, and after that there was the question of the South Field and the Santa Fe market, and whether the spring rains would cooperate or whether the drought would come back for another season. The debt from the bad year was down, but not gone. The barn roof had held through winter, but would need proper attention before next fall. There was always something, and there would always be something, because that was ranching, and that was life, and the frontier had never made promises to anyone about ease. But the family was not broken anymore. Bent, still, in places. Bent in the permanent ways that loss bends people, which don't unbend. Gideon still had mornings when the grief came back on him like weather, and he went quiet and interior in the way she'd learned to recognize and give room to. Thomas still had flashes of the old armor, moments when something got too close and he went sharp-edged in self-defense, usually followed by an awkward retreat and a rinsed dish or some other small act of compensation. Lily still had her watchfulness, still paid attention to the people around her with that careful 7-year-old precision that would probably never fully go away, because some things you learn young, and they become part of how you see the world forever. None of them were fixed, but they were, Elena thought, functional. They were a family that had learned to function around its damage rather than being stopped by it. That was not nothing. That was actually quite a lot. Gideon asked her to marry him on a Tuesday, which she would always think was a very Gideon choice of day. Not a Sunday, not a holiday, not any kind of occasion. Just a Tuesday in late February, plain and cold and unremarkable, which meant it wasn't about the occasion. It was just the day he was ready. They were in the barn. She'd come out to tell him supper was 20 minutes away and found him mending a section of bridle with the particular focused expression he brought to small, careful work. And she told him supper was close, and he set the bridle down and stood up and said without preamble, "I want to marry you." She looked at him. "I'm not good at this," he said, "saying things the right way. But I've been thinking about it for a while, and I'd rather say it badly than not say it." He held her gaze. "You came here and you didn't fix us. I don't think that's what happened, but you stayed and you didn't leave when it was hard. And the children—" He stopped. "Thomas told me last week that he thinks of you as—" He didn't use a word for it. He said, "You're someone he'd want around. For him, that's—" "I know what that is," she said. "And Lily, I know." He was quiet for a moment. "And me," he said. "I want you around. Not in the way things have been. As my wife. As part of this." He gestured slightly, meaning the barn, the ranch, all of it. "If you want that." Elena stood in the barn with the smell of hay and horses and cold air, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in July with a worn canvas bag and a letter, and the specific loneliness of a person who had spent years putting other people's houses in order and had stopped thinking about what her own house might look like. She had stopped counting the days in August. She'd noticed that. She hadn't noticed until now what it meant. "Yes," she said, the same word she'd said in November over the soup that was getting cold when Lily had asked if she was staying. But it was a different yes. It was a larger one. Something in Gideon's face did what it rarely did. It opened up, fully, without the careful management he usually applied to his expressions. He looked for a moment like a man who has been granted something he talked himself out of wanting because wanting it too much seemed dangerous, and now had it, and didn't know yet how to hold that without it scaring him. He crossed to her and put his hands on either side of her face carefully, the way he did everything that mattered to him, and he kissed her. Not desperate, not dramatic, just real and deliberate and present. When he pulled back, he was still close, and she could see the lines in his face and the gray at his temples, and the particular complicated light in his eyes that she'd been reading for months without being able to fully name it. And now she thought maybe she could name it. "You should get back inside," she said. "Supper in 20 minutes. He laughed. Actually laughed. A short, genuine sound that she'd heard maybe 3 times since July, and each time it surprised her because it changed his whole face. "All right," he said. She went back inside. He came in 10 minutes later and sat at the table and looked at her across the kitchen with that new open expression, and Elena put the pot on the table and called the children, and did not make any announcement because the children could wait until morning. That evening, sitting by the fire, she felt the weight of something she hadn't known she'd been carrying, the possibility that she might not stay, that this wasn't permanent, that she was still in the position of being someone who could be asked to leave. That weight had been there so long she'd stopped noticing it, and now it was gone. She noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a sound that's been in the background for so long you forgot it was there. She told the children at breakfast. Lily's face went through 5 things in approximately 2 seconds and landed on something that was trying hard to be dignified and settled instead for just being purely, completely glad. She got up from her chair and hugged Elena from the side, both arms around her waist, her face pressed against Elena's arm, and she didn't say anything, which said everything. Thomas looked at his father, then at Elena, then at his father again. "Does this mean she's staying permanently?" he asked. "Yes," Gideon said. Thomas picked up his fork. "Good," he said, and ate his breakfast. He said it the way he said things that he felt strongly about and was not going to perform feelings around, which was fine. Elena knew what it cost him to say even that one word with that amount of simple honesty, and she held it accordingly. They were married in April, when the ground had thawed, and the first green things were coming back in the garden. It was a small ceremony. Raymond Clemens, who served as justice of the peace when needed, came out to the ranch on a Saturday afternoon. The Henderson family came, and a few others from town who had moved from suspicion to something warmer over the months, as people in small towns do once they've decided to revise their position. Mildred Crane from the dry goods store stood near the back and watched with the expression of a woman who has revised her position and is choosing to do so gracefully, which Elena appreciated. Lily wore her best dress and stood very straight and took her role as witness with the seriousness of a diplomat. Thomas stood beside his father in a shirt that Elena had mended twice and pressed that morning. And when Clemens said the final words and Gideon took Elena's hand, Thomas looked at the ground for a moment and then looked back up and kept his face composed, and Elena saw his jaw move once, and she saw him decide something inside himself, and then he was fine. After, standing in the yard with the April sun on everything and the creek running again with the spring melt, Thomas came and stood beside her. Just stood there for a moment, the two of them looking at the fields where Gideon was talking to Henderson. "The south field looks better," Thomas said. "The rain helped," she said. "The planting helped too." He paused. "You and Papa planned that right." "We did," she said. Another pause. He had his hands in his pockets, looking at the field with a squint that was starting to look like his father's squint. "Miss Mercer," he started, and then stopped. "Elena," she said. It was the first time she'd offered it. He considered this. "Elena," he said, tried how it sat. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "I want to learn the accounts, the ledger, the way you do it." He still wasn't looking at her. "I want to know how the ranch works. All of it. Not just the horses and the fences. The numbers part." She looked at him. 13 now, nearly, with another couple inches of height he'd acquired somewhere between December and April, and a quality of intention about him that had been there all along under the anger, just waiting for the anger to move. "I'll teach you," she said. He nodded as if this had been a business arrangement he'd been moderately confident about. "Monday," he said, "after school." "Monday," she agreed. He went to join his father at the fence line, and Elena watched him go. The particular walk of a boy becoming something else, not a man yet, but aimed in that direction, finding his own stride. The south field came in well that spring, not perfectly. There was a section in the northeast corner that drained badly after the April rains, and lost about a fifth of the planting there. The rest made up for it well enough that the yields, when they calculated them in late summer, came in at nearly 70% of the estimate Elena had presented to Gideon the previous winter. The Santa Fe trader, contacted through Harlan's introduction, paid a fair price. It was not a transformation. She wanted to be clear about that, in her own accounting of things. The ranch was solvent now rather than precarious, which was a meaningful difference, but not a dramatic one. It would take several more good years to build the kind of reserves that made a ranching operation genuinely secure, and good years were not guaranteed to anyone in that part of the territory. The drought could return. Markets shifted. Animals got sick. Roofs developed new problems after you'd fixed the old ones. But the Hale Ranch had gone from surviving by the narrowest margins to building something with a forward direction, and that was the thing that mattered. You could work with forward direction. You couldn't work with the turned-inward, survival-only posture that the ranch had been running on when Elena arrived. There was a day in July, almost exactly a year from when she'd stepped off the stage into the Briar Ridge dust, when she was in the garden with Lily and she looked up and saw Thomas at the corral fence, talking to his father about something, gesturing toward the north pasture, and Gideon listening and then nodding slowly and saying something back. A conversation between a father and his son about the ranch they both tended and both cared about, conducted as a conversation between two people who had learned, imperfectly and slowly, how to talk to each other. Lily was saying something about the tomatoes. Elena looked back down at the garden. "Look," Lily said, and held up a tomato. The first ripe one, fat and red, grown from the seeds she'd started on the kitchen windowsill in February. "Good," Elena said. "Can we have it at supper?" "It's your tomato," Elena said. "You decide." Lily turned it over in her hands. "I want Papa to have it," she said. "He likes them." She said it simply, the way she said true things, without sentiment but with complete certainty. "He hasn't had a good tomato since—" She stopped, reconsidered. "In a long time." Elena looked at the girl, 8 years old now, still with the crooked braids she did herself every morning, still with the large, careful eyes that missed nothing, still carrying the particular weight of a child who had learned early that love was not a guaranteed condition, that you had to tend it the way you tended a garden, with attention and patience and the understanding that some things didn't survive winter, and the job was to put enough care into what remained that it came back. But she was also just a girl with a tomato, wanting to give it to her father. "Then give it to him at supper," Elena said. At the table that evening, Lily put the tomato on Gideon's plate without explanation. He looked at it, looked at Lily. "From the garden," Lily said. "I grew it." He picked it up. He turned it over in his hand the way he turned things over, carefully, taking stock of the actual object rather than the idea of it. Then he set it back on his plate and looked at his daughter. "Thank you," he said. It was a small moment. It did not resolve anything remaining unresolved or signal any particular arrival at peace. Gideon still had his silences, and Thomas still had his walls, and Lily still paid attention to everything with that child economist precision. Elena still made decisions by practical accounting rather than instinct, and still found warmth a harder language than work. And she was still, in many small ways, figuring out how to be part of something rather than the person who managed something from a careful distance. None of them had become easier versions of themselves. That was not how it worked. The rough edges stayed rough. The difficult parts stayed difficult, just navigated differently, with more knowledge of the terrain. But the house was warm. That was the thing Elena came back to, that late July evening at the supper table with the tomato and the children and the man who had moved out of his own doorway a year ago to let her in. The house was warm and the table was full, and outside the south field was green and the creek was running, and the Hale family was not a family that had healed from grief so much as a family that had learned to carry it together, which was different and harder and more real. There was a moment after supper, standing at the kitchen window in the last light of the day, that Elena let herself look at it plainly, not with sentiment, not with the glossy retrospective feeling of a person constructing a narrative, just looking at it plainly, the way she looked at the ledger or the garden or anything else she needed to assess accurately. She had arrived in this town because a dead man had written a letter and a placement agency had cashed a check, and she'd had nowhere better to go. She had stayed because the children needed feeding and the house needed tending, and she was good at those things, and she'd made a commitment. Those were the practical facts of it. But somewhere between the first morning she'd lit the stove and the afternoon she'd pulled frozen carrots from the ground by lamplight, and the evening Gideon had put his face in his hands and she'd stayed in the room, somewhere in all of it, the practical facts had become something else. Not despite being practical. Not in spite of the work being real and unglamorous and sometimes grinding. Because of it. Because she had learned, slowly and not without resistance, that love at its most honest doesn't look like the feeling of it. It looks like the work of it. It looks like staying when leaving is easier. Like lighting the stove on the second morning and the 100th morning, not because it's romantic, but because the people in the house need to be warm. She'd spent years understanding that about other people's families. It had taken this particular family, in this particular house, to make her understand it about herself. The frontier was not a kind place. It had never pretended to be. It took things. It had taken Clara Hale on a slow progression of bad weeks, had taken Albert Hale before he could see what he'd set in motion with his letter, had taken the creek and the hay crop and 2 cold seasons and one man's capacity for hope down to somewhere very close to nothing. But it also produced, occasionally, something stubborn, something that refused the easiest version of events, a garden that came back after frost, a roof that held, a boy who cried after a year of not crying and came back to the breakfast table the next morning, a man who moved out of a doorway, a woman who stayed, Through the window, she could see the last of the day's light on the south field, the green of it going amber in the dusk. Thomas was at the corral, doing the evening check on the horses the way Gideon had taught him, moving with a competence that had come from somewhere between stubbornness and willingness. Lily had gone upstairs, and Elena could hear the particular sound of a child who is not yet asleep but is thinking about it. Small movements, the creak of the bed, the settling into evening. Gideon came and stood beside her at the window. He didn't say anything. He put his hand on her back between her shoulders, just rested it there, the way you rest your hand on something solid, something you don't need to hold on to because it isn't going anywhere. She looked out at the field. The drought was over. The ranch was standing. The house was warm. None of it had come easy, and none of it had come clean. And there were hard seasons ahead that neither of them could see yet, and the people who had become her family were imperfect in all the specific ways that made them real, which was to say, in all the ways that actually mattered. She had arrived with a canvas bag and a dead man's letter, and a town full of people who'd already decided she was someone else's problem. She had stayed. That was the whole story. That was all of it. Not the grand gesture or the revelation or the moment where everything became simple. Just the accumulating weight of days, and the choice made in each one to remain, and what that choice built, slowly and imperfectly, over the course of a year. She stayed, and that was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.